Good afternoon. So for the first session of our keynote launch, have a seat, Joe. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce and to interview Joe Lonsdale. Joe, as you probably are aware, is the founder of 8VC, which is a leading venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. Joe is viewed by many as sort of the leader of the new group of venture capitalists doing important things. He's previously was the co-founder of Palantir, OpenGov, Adapar, and a number of very significant disruptive businesses. And he's somebody that we just admire quite a bit. So it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk with him today.
Thanks, Michael, for having me today.
So Joe, your motto at 8VC is "The world's broken, let's fix it." How does that, when you think about education, how does that apply?
Sure. Well, I think it definitely applies to education, as I think probably most people here are quite aware, given there's so many people working on amazing ways of fixing our education system and making it work better. I think there's a lot of platitudes everyone's already heard about how it's designed for a different economy 100, 200 years ago. I think the bigger question is, why is it so broken and why is it so hard to fix? And I do think we're making a lot of great progress, but I think one of the big problems is that we've taken away any sort of system of market or incentives that you would normally get in other industries. And so when you come up with really good ideas, and other startup companies we've built, you're able to kind of compete in a market, and if it works, it grows bigger, rather than having to go and try to convince state legislatures that your startup is good. I probably wouldn't be here as a known entrepreneur if my job had been to have to go convince all these government officials. And so I think the really key thing for fixing education is the policy has to align incentives and markets and financial incentives with success. And so my favorite way of doing that right now that I think would actually help us fix it is at the college level. I think the loan system is really broken. I think instead of giving loans per student, which allows all these schools to be diploma mills, I think the schools should get paid by their students' success long term, and there's ways of aligning incentives that way, which would let us innovate.
That's worth a clap. Good.
Thanks.
So which is the one area that no one's focusing on today, but 3 years from now is going to be really important to society?
You mean generally in Silicon
Valley? Yeah, generally.
That's an interesting question. So I guess to skip away from education for a bit, I do think this is a really important area to fix with the incentives thing that people probably aren't focused on enough. But outside of that, in Silicon Valley, the big question we always ask is what's possible now that was not possible 5 years ago, right? So for example, before the smartphone existed, if you tried to start a company like Uber or even Airbnb, I think it'd be really difficult to get it to scale. But after the smartphone existed, those are great companies. And if you try to start those nowadays, you'd be 10 years late. And so the thing is, what's new right now that's happening? And in my mind, the biggest new thing that's going to create the most value that is still not getting nearly enough attention is the overlap between biotech and IT. There's been a lot of breakthroughs in the last 3 or 4 years that allow us to do things with reading and writing DNA and synthetic biology, and how we understand the microbiome, and how we train T cells to hunt cancer, and all these things that kind of take computer scientists with biotech. So for me, that's the probably most exciting new area in Silicon Valley.
Great. So talk about the trend you call the smart enterprises wave, and what implications does that have to the future of work and jobs?
Sure. So the smart enterprise wave is a theme that we talk a lot about at our fund and with some of our friends. The basic idea is that in Silicon Valley, we've had these different waves based on new things that are possible. And of course, if you go back about 30 or 40 years, you had a lot of the first software built that runs most of the big industries in the US, right? So if you go into a lot of education systems still, if you go into a lot of hospitals, government organizations, logistics companies, they're all running off of software built in the 70s or 80s. And what the smart enterprise wave is it's a new wave of companies that really started, in Palantir and Adapar, I guess, and things I've been involved in are probably included in this wave, where they're for the first time coming in and replacing a lot of these systems from 3 or 4 decades ago. And that's happening at a really fast pace. And the reason that's happening now, after not having happened for a few decades, is a lot of these industries, for the first time, are capturing all this data, and they need to integrate that data, and they need to ask questions of it, and they need to do basically nonlinear things with that data. So and these old systems are very good at doing the very simple linear workflows they were created to do, but you're not able to do nonlinear workflows with these systems. And so as these new platforms get in place and kind of aggregate the data for these different industries, you basically end up fixing these industries, making them innovate a lot faster. And I guess you're saying, what does it mean for work? Basically, a lot of the stuff that can be automated with data will be automated. And so it means in order to do work, you have to be more creative, entrepreneurial. You have to be doing more thinking work and less kind of routine automatable work.
And I want to get in this deeper in a few minutes, but you've written a couple great essays that I encourage anybody to go Google search on kind of the Keynes point that I mentioned last night about how, 1930, he talked about technological unemployment. And so you think about the automation, and as it relates to innovation, some people say it's kind of the end of man or whatever, but you talk about how this really should be a driver of new great jobs and innovation. So we'll talk a little bit about that.
Sure, no, yeah, we're guilty of being an optimist here, which I think it's very popular in Silicon Valley right now to forecast the end of all jobs and a disaster, which is quite ironic if you look at the fact that we have tighter labor markets in the last year or two than we've had in a very long time. And I think jobs work from the bottom up, not the top down. It's very, very hard to kind of map out as if you're like a socialist country, like what the jobs are going to be and how they're going to work. But I think these things do tend to work. And the point is, like, yeah, Keynes was very interested 100 years ago in technological unemployment. And I think it's worth going back and reading that essay in light of current affairs and how much he was sure that there'd basically be nothing at all for people to do as these trends of automation continued. And my generally optimistic view is that there's just so many new ways that we've continued to create jobs over the last 100 years. And unless AI gets to the point where it's actually smarter than each of us, and if it gets to that point, by the way, we have a whole other set of problems about the existential nature of our lives. But until it gets to that point, I think there's just a lot of areas that I'm very bullish on. Yeah,
and again, Joe wrote two terrific essays. But one I thought was interesting is how right he was on certain things, from a macroeconomic standpoint, and how wrong he was basically on the...
Keynes predicted our level of income pretty accurately 100 years ago. He definitely got a lot of that right, but he assumed that the nature of people was to only work to make a living, as opposed to work for reasons of frankly of fixing the world and of expressing ourselves and things like that. So he assumed that once everyone got to like a middle class 1930s level, you'd have no interest in doing work anymore if you didn't have to. You'd only work a few hours a week, but obviously that's not what society wants.
Right. So talk about your perspective on human-machine symbiosis, and how does this relationship affect education?
Sure. So the topic of, we call it, I guess, it originally was called man-machine symbiosis in the 1960s. I guess you're not allowed to use that term anymore. So now it's human-machine symbiosis. That's funny. I mean, the basic idea is there's certain things people are better at, and there's certain things machines are better at. So like when you talk about the smart enterprise wave, and you're going in and you're kind of automating and putting a layer of data and computation in all these industries, not necessarily replacing people, you're augmenting them. And so the question is, like, what skills do people need in that world? And I guess this is especially relevant for education, because a lot of the way education was taught historically, which was a lot more rote and was a lot more structured, that might work well in a world where people need to do a lot of these kind of more structured and rote tasks. But as computers can handle more and more of that for us, and we're pushed much more into the creative and analytical side of work, that means education really should be reflecting that, and it needs to be reflecting that if people are going to have relevant skills in the economy in the next couple of decades.
That's great. And again, one of the things I loved about the paper, a number of people talk about, and you talk about your optimism about people find ways to create and innovate, so this idea that jobs are going away, there's no ever going to be any new work, is some people predict, but a lot of people tell you, well, no, people create and so forth. One of the things I love about your essay is you go to the next step and you actually talk about 12 distinct jobs of the future. So talk about some of those jobs and why you think those will be kind of the future of work.
That's kind of fun. It's always a little bit ridiculous to try to predict, 30, 40, 50 years ahead what jobs would look like. I guess the analogy is if you try to tell someone in the 1880s or early 1900s what MTV and air traffic controllers and things were like, it's at that point they're like, what are you talking about? So with that kind of ridiculousness in mind, there's a lot of areas I think are really interesting. Like some of the more creative ones I think it's going to be possible to quantify how your mind works in a lot of different ways and how it's responding. And so I think there's going to be a lot more coaching in terms of understanding. You can watch yourself at work that day, and you could see, well, here's where I got really insecure, or here's where I got angry, or here's where I reacted really badly and had all this ego that made me miss this. And so as you quantify that, maybe there's jobs or people working with you in a much kind of deeper psychological coach type of way. That'd be one kind of fun example. Another silly example is there's probably all sorts of new animals we can design and create that will play different roles in our society, and the whole industry around designing them and working with them and caring for them. There's going to be a lot of people employed there. And then there's more obvious things. I mean, one of the more obvious things is baby boomers are getting older, and they're probably going to need and want a lot of special attention. And there's probably millions of potential jobs around how senior care adapts and how the human touch is important in senior care. And if you kind of draw that out, there's just a huge amount to do there, and there's a huge lack of people available, even in the U.S. Right now, who could take those jobs. And so those are just a few examples. There's an article we wrote in Wired that had a bunch of them. So I think it is kind of fun to think about and be optimistic about.
So how many people in the room have heard of Palantir? So, and I can't really see the percentage, but so Palantir is probably the biggest and most important company that some of you never heard about. And in fact, so its market value is somewhere between 10 and $20 billion. But more significantly, anybody who's...
You would know the secondary market, huh?
But we might have a little bit of a perspective. But actually, more importantly, if you've ever been to Palo Alto and you walk around downtown Palo Alto, you see that about 25 buildings have the name Palantir on it. So what I say is pretty soon Palo Alto is going to change its name to Palantir. But anyway, and Joe is the co-founder of that. So talk about big data. And when you started Palantir in 2004?
Yeah, we started working on it a little bit in 2003 and launched it in 2004. That's right. And by the way, I'm a victim of the Palo Alto real estate thing too. It's kind of annoying. So yeah. I apologize for that.
So talk about what you saw for the opportunity of big data then versus how you see big data and Palantir solving issues today and how it's progressed. And then maybe a little bit about how you think big data can be applied in the education and talent world.
Sure. Well, when we were starting Palantir, it was much more about like productizing these large areas of IT services. That was the initial view of where we were coming from. And so I don't want to talk too much about it, but the high level idea was that there's like $100 billion a year spent on kind of building these platforms within areas like government and finance and others. Government and finance are the two biggest. And rather than spend so much money every time on these new service platforms, can we design a product out of the box that does the vast majority of that? And so, instead of doing a $3 billion contract for DHS with someone like a Unisys or whatever, can we do that out of the box in a couple of months based on a platform we designed? And so, but back then you didn't really have much talk of any big data or anything like that, but it was clear that the platforms that allow people to collaborate with data and connect and kind of empower humans to navigate huge amounts of data and make decisions was pretty broken. And it's pretty clear stuff like 9/11 should not have happened if data was being brought together and used effectively. And you had to kind of create these processes through technology that made it easier to collaborate and to access all of this. And so obviously it was a very mission-driven company inspired to go in, fix how the intelligence community shared data, make sure it was done in a better way, but also a way that worked with civil liberties. And then obviously finance, healthcare, energy, all these other industries had that problem too. I think Palantir was very lucky to kind of catch this wave, a few years ahead of time. Like most of these companies were started 2010, 2012 in terms of the big data stuff. And because we were already there doing that, as all these industries realized this was a problem, I think Palantir was able to grow very quickly at that point. The thing I'd say that people still don't realize, there's all this stuff about AI right now and how AI is gonna change everything. And it is true that AI is being used very well, especially by like Amazon and Google and some of these more sophisticated companies. But a lot of these big industries, the problem is not how you analyze things. It's the fact that the data is still not all together. It's actually very, very expensive and very hard to build the processes that capture the data and bring it all to one place and let you work on it. So the effort usually is like you need like several hundred people to get the data together in order to have it there. And then you can hire like a couple AI grad students and a few friends, and we can map out this like genius thing. And everyone wants to talk about what those genius grad students are doing on our platform, but it's really like the platform underneath it and getting it all there that's most of the work and most of the value.
So talk about how you could see big data impact the education world?
Definitely, and I think there's probably a lot of people in the audience who know this better than me, but I mean, I'm involved in a few companies doing that. And it's a similar thing. The question is, how do you collect relevant data that you can then use in ways that are not, that you can calculate in nonlinear ways, you can personalize things for people. So I guess there's two sides of it that are pretty obvious. On one side, I think it's very important to just to get better at like knowing exactly where students are in terms of large ontologies of learning, and to learn over time through the same way we do online A/B testing for like getting people to want to buy a product. You could do A/B testing for what works for students with this background, this skill set. They need to learn this. What's the best way to get them to learn this quickly? What's the best way to make sure we're not leaving them behind? So I mean, there's a lot of great people working on that here. I think we're going to learn faster what kind of personalization with data works. We're going to learn faster how to capture that data better in order to feed into those algorithms. So I think that's one side. I think the other side is the big institutions and them using data to learn to predict. So I guess going back to the thing I said initially, I think this is an important topic, is how do you align incentives for large institutions? So I think the best way, for example, vocational schools should work is there should be financial intermediaries loaning money to them, and the schools are getting paid back by their students' career success. And so basically big data allows you to measure the skills the students are learning, allows you to measure their early career success, allows you to understand which of these schools should get more resources and less resources financially because they're going to be able to train students better. And so I think both on the financial incentive side of education and on the personalized learning side, it's really important.
So talk about the Hyperloop, because you're involved in a number of big ideas, but this is a very big idea. So first talk about how it all came about, and then talk about what it is and where you think it can go.
All right. We'll talk about the Hyperloop. I am lucky to have led the Series A and the biggest Hyperloop company, which, as many of you know, Hyperloop is an idea that has been around for a while in different forms, but was named and popularized by Elon Musk. And the basic idea is that you could take these high-speed trains in Japan that go about 300 miles per hour, and you could wrap a steel cylinder around them, take out the air, and do a few other complicated engineering things that are above my pay grade as a computer scientist. And you can get them to go 700, 750 miles per hour, and they take up a lot less energy to run. So it's a very important advance in transportation. It's pretty clear to a lot of people this is possible. We're planning on having a working prototype that we've spent over $100 million on in the Nevada desert, pretty nearby here, I guess, relative to California. We're going to have that working prototype hopefully this summer, it looks like. And I guess the reason I'm most passionate about the Hyperloop, first of all, it'd be really cool to be able to get to Utah or Vegas a lot more quickly and not have to wait at the airport. So that's a neat one. But the really most important thing is what this does for cities around America. One of the big challenges that a lot of us discuss is how if you're not really well off, it's really hard to be part of the Silicon Valley economy right now, because there's all these NIMBY groups that have stopped us from building more in the Bay Area. It's a huge issue, and you can't blame people. They buy a house, they want the value to go up. They basically stop you from building in the area. And so we've gotten to the point now where Silicon Valley is more expensive than anywhere else in the country, and it makes it really hard for me to build companies there. Frankly, my friends to build companies there, and it's really unfair to up and coming people who want to be part of the ecosystem that it's just so expensive to live there. So the question is, how do you fix this? And one way you fix this is you fight NIMBYism. You try to go to one of these cities and get them to build something, which a lot of us are trying to do, and that'd be good for the economy. It'd be good for income mobility, basically, people to be able to come and join. But the other really neat kind of cheat code we could do is the Hyperloop. And the reason that's a cheat code is if you can build a tunnel underground and you have a bunch of stops around the Bay Area, and you could have inexpensive middle-class housing 200 miles outside the city, and you can commute in 10 or 15 minutes, that completely changes the nature of this problem, right? So this could actually be a really big deal for income inequality in America if we can deploy Hyperloop type infrastructure for making it possible to live in these areas. And so that's something I'm very excited about.
Yeah, you mentioned Elon Musk, and you've worked and founded businesses with Elon Musk and Peter Thiel. What have you learned, or lessons from two people that obviously are big thinkers and doing incredible things? What are some of the takeaways?
Sure, I've worked a lot more closely with Peter than Elon, although I definitely admire both of them. We have something online I wrote to everyone at Palantir about things I learned from Peter, I guess. He's probably one of the best conceptual minds I've worked with. There's just a lot of really good intellectual discipline, I'd say. We've written about it more online. One of the things is that your output is convex. And it's ironic given that we're talking about all these different things, but at any given time, like my rule is I'm only responsible for the failure of one thing. And that really came from kind of having worked with him and his network. And basically the more time you spend on any one thing, it's exponential what you can get done. So you don't want to divide your efforts. I think is a really key lesson as an entrepreneur. Another thing that Peter really focused on, I know Elon does too, is how valuable top talent is. Like those top 1% of people who are really, really smart, really eager to work really hard, mission driven. Like spending your time getting the top talent around you is probably the most important thing you could do. And when you talk about that, the returns to intelligence and drive are probably higher than almost anything else. And so I think both Peter and Elon value experience, but you actually even more value drive and intelligence in a core team because you can always learn and iterate. So I thought that was good. And I mean, I guess another thing with Peter I'd say is there's always lots of stuff going on, and a lot of people like to talk about the fact that they're going to do something or they're going to talk about it, and he never talks about what he's going to do. He just does it now. He just like jumps right into the strategy, right into the getting it done, and very efficient with his time. So, but both those guys and what they built at PayPal, where I was lucky to be an intern, and what Peter and I built together is great to learn from them.
So you were a initial investor in Oculus, which was bought by Facebook. What do you see as the potential for VR in the education world and future work?
Definitely, yeah. Well, Oculus was an amazing team. We're very lucky to be involved there. One of the early pieces of excitement was what's possible in education there. I don't know exactly how far off we are. I know there's a lot of people working on really great VR education right now, and I'd love it to be the case that it's so useful that it's going to be in every classroom in the next decade. I think that may be the case. I always loved history, so I thought that would be a really fun way to teach history and that kind of interaction. But in general, I think what you're going to see is it's going to go back to that personalized learning thing, where I think people learn a lot better when they're inspired and when they're engaged based on stuff they really care about. And so the question is to develop different types of content that's inspiring for kids in the right way and that engages them with the topics in the right way. One of the, I guess the example I'd give is one of our friends is the world chess champion, Magnus Carlsen, and I always would ask him how he'd studied because I was curious. I was a chess player myself, and he'd get all this homework each day, but each day he'd only do half of his homework. He'd only do the half that he was most passionate about and most interested in, and that was a better way to learn. And I think that's true for a lot of things. You only want to engage, and educate and learn about things you're passionate about. So if we can use that to better engage kids, to get them more into environments, to make things more real, I think that's really powerful.
One of the megatrends that you're focused on is mass urbanization. And we talked about the Hyperloop as it related to kind of future work, but what other kind of implications does that have for the future work? What kind of trends do you see, and what kind of problems are we fixing?
So just break. I think if anything, it's one of those things where it's probably gonna. I think it's funny you asked about right after VR because I think we're probably having this massive urbanization trend right now because the returns to working together in these high growth economic areas are so high. But I guess my hope would be that at some point within the next decade or two, the VR and the AR and the video screen technology is just so flawless and so good that we could be having this speech and no one would know that I'm actually sitting at home, or whatever, and didn't have to fly or whatnot. Which we'd be interacting just as well, doing that otherwise. And so I think it's like a very binary thing where you have the network effect of these like top cities. It just keeps growing exponentially and everyone has to be part of it. But I think it just breaks right away at some point very dramatically when the technology gets good enough to not allow that. So I think it may be the case that pretty soon we are able to actually work in a distributed fashion and it won't matter as much. So we'll see.
And you think and care a lot about government and government's role in different areas. What role do you think the state and federal government, biggest role they can play as it relates to education and maybe back to the original mission of fixing what's broken in the world?
Sure. Well, I mean, and this gets to be pretty controversial because we all have very different views on how governments work. I mean, I think going back to what we talked about before, I think it's really important to make room for innovators to get into the education world. And the question is, in what ways can innovation be allowed into education? In what ways can it be allowed to spread with market-like structures? And obviously, markets are very powerful, very useful things. But you got to be careful because markets can also leave people behind. And so the question is, how do we use markets without leaving the bottom behind there? And I think that's one of the government's biggest jobs to create the biggest thing I would say is we need to remember that the founders of America set it up so that we'd have laboratories of democracy. We'd have areas where we could try new things rather than imposing something on everyone. So making sure the states are able to try new things, making sure we're able to create areas where we can explore new incentives and see how they work and see how that grows and work with innovators to do that. I think is probably the biggest role they can have is to make sure we are allowing innovation, make sure we are allowing people to try things out.
So what do you see as after the smart enterprises wave? What's next?
There's a lot of different debates around this. Some people think augmented reality is going to be so powerful and it's just going to change everything about how we interact, and it's going to, rather than have the phone in your pocket, there's going to be, maybe it's a little camera like the Google Glass guys are trying to do. It's probably going to be the case they were like 10 or 15 years early. I think there's a lot of new things there. I personally am most excited about all the bio-IT stuff I talked about earlier. I think that's where the most kind of impact's going to be had in the next decade in terms of just fundamentally changing how we understand our health and how human lifespan works and how we're able to kind of keep our minds and our bodies, in a way that I think it's very inspiring what we're going to be able to do over the next 10, 20 years there. So for me, I'm hoping that's the biggest next area.
So I've got one last question for you. So you've got something like 400 education talent CEOs in the room. If you were to think about one bit of advice that you could give them, how they can create a successful business or something to really focus on, and you've given a lot of different input, what Peter's told you and what you've experienced yourself. But if there's one bit of advice you wanted to leave those entrepreneurs with, what would that be?
Gosh, that's a tough one. So I probably would have to do something more general to entrepreneurship, because I myself have not yet built a successful education company, so I wouldn't feel very good telling you how to do that. It seems a lot harder than building a successful healthcare or finance company in a lot of ways because of how the market's set up. I guess it's just a couple obvious things that I think are really important. Is find people who have been really successful in your particular field and get them on your side as best as you can. And when you're getting going with these things, the most important thing is not how much money you make for yourself for these companies. If you want to be successful long term, the question is how can you surround yourself with people who are going to be helpful to you long term, and how can you help them, and how can you get them allied in the right way. So I think that's always been very helpful for the things I've been lucky to work on.
Thank you very much. Give Joe a hand, please.
Cool.
Awesome. It was awesome.